Hi, I'm Meeka Marsolais.
And I'm Katrina Prescott, and you're listening to
Talking Aging on the Whole Care Network. Thank you so much for listening. On today's episode of Talking Aging, we will be talking about the documentary film Stolen Time. Katrina and I are joined by the director of the film, Helene Klodawksy, and by UBC Professor Dr. Julia Henderson, whose research focuses on redressing ageism in North American culture. The film Stolen Time is a co-production of the National Film Board of Canada and Intuitive Pictures Incorporated. It is a feature documentary that follows an elder rights lawyer taking on the for-profit nursing home industry in Ontario. So it's a compelling call for justice from desperate families who've turned to the courts. We also hear from frontline caregivers who are working in long-term care or who are caring for loved ones who live in long-term care. It is a rare look inside a legal battle and the emerging elder justice movement. So I highly recommend you see the film. You can find out more about it on the NFB website or just by Googling Stolen Time. Thank you so much for listening to our episode today. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. Stolen Time is a riveting feature documentary following a charismatic elder rights lawyer, Melissa Miller, and hundreds of aggrieved families taking on the corporate for-profit nursing home industry. So as we know, this is an industry that notoriously lacks transparency and accountability. The documentary takes place in Ontario, but the issues that it's addressing are happening all across the country. So Helene, Katrina and I, we both saw Stolen Time and we walked away absolutely devastated by the current state of affairs of elder care in this country. We were also absolutely inspired by the hard work and the determination that of so many people coming together to protect seniors and anyone living in long-term care and the people that care about them. So we're thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you, and we'd love to hear from you. Can you tell us a bit about the title Stolen Time and how that relates to the film?
It's just great to be able to speak to you and feel your enthusiasm for our film because we're people say that it's a film, a call to action. And I think together with telling so many people about the film, we will change the state of long-term care in Canada. That's really my hope, and I think the hope of Melissa Miller, who is the lead character. The title just came into my head one day, and I would say that sometimes as a filmmaker, and I'm sure all of you are very creative in what you do, that sometimes as a filmmaker, I feel very much like I'm a vessel for something that needs to be said. And I think when the planets align or when the cosmos aligns, and I'm part of that, I am sometimes sent a subject matter or a character, and also in this case, the name of the film. The name was chosen at the very beginning, and we never found a better one. So Stolen Time, but I think it does refer to the sense that life is so precious, and we know when our elders or the vulnerable people that around us that might not have so much time, the feeling that they might be neglected is so egregious that I feel Stolen Time sort of names that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I definitely agree. And yeah, what inspired you to make this documentary and how did it all come together? Give us the history.
Right. Well, the idea for the film really came to me at the very start of COVID. It wasn't even in Canada. I would say we were hearing about it in Europe. And I have a number of friends whose parents are in long-term care homes or whose spouse is in a long-term care home. I have a very good friend who's been in a long-term care home for many years. And the loved ones of these people, they just knew that the situation in long-term care is so fragile that they felt very worried for their relatives. And so I was learning about their worry, their concern. But I think what was really the game changer for me was just by chance, I saw a video from 2018. So that's a couple years before COVID, of an amazing young lawyer who's fighting for the rights of older people, vulnerable people, the most vulnerable people in our society, I would say. And her name is Melissa Miller, and she was talking about fighting corporate greed in long-term care. And I just knew after seeing her that I wanted her to be the character of my next film. I didn't have any money, but I called her and I said, would you be open to being in this film that I haven't yet made, but I know that we should make? And after a while, I convinced her, and along with my producer Ina Fitchman, we convinced the people at her law firm, Howie Sachs and Henry, and together with the film board, we were off.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Amazing.
absolutely. And Julia, I have a question for you. So in the film, there's a quote, I think it's one of the PSWs mentions that the way we treat our most vulnerable seniors is a mark of how we're doing as a country. So I'd love to hear from you and your experience and your studies. What's your opinion of how we're doing as a country?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think the film is testament to how we're doing, right? It exposes, those alleged cases of mistreatment in long-term care in the Ontario setting. And then if we look at BC, we can turn to the reports from the Office of the Seniors Advocate. So there was a 2023 report called Billions More Reason to Care. And some of the highlights from that report that looked at the 2021-22 financial records of 181 facilities. And it showed that for-profit facilities were routinely under-delivering on care. So they delivered in that time period 500,000 fewer direct care hours than they were funded for by the province. Whereas not-for-profit societies who were also contracted to deliver publicly funded beds, they delivered 93,000 more hours of care than they were funded for. So you can see that enormous discrepancy, right, between the for-profit companies and the not-for-profit. And if we also look at reports of incidents of complaints, so there's a 2021 report by the BC Health Authority that showed 60% of the substantiated complaints in long-term care facilities across the 5 health authorities were against for-profit companies. And those are companies that are operating only 35% of the long-term care beds. So these are complaints, things like staffing, neglect, quality of care, record keeping, nutrition, policy implementation. So I think, we really do have a lot of challenges, particularly in the for-profit sector. And the Seniors Advocate of BC, I can speak best to BC, has really highlighted the need for fundamental change and some really serious conversations.
Yeah, and BC, I think, is unique because we have a seniors advocate. Ontario doesn't even have somebody in that position. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've done some work with that office, and they always remind me we are still government employees. It's so, but we need that. At least they can bring these things to light. And it's so important, and hopefully it does influence policy and actually drive a little bit of change. And I appreciate hearing those stats. I personally was very moved by this movie because of my experience as a caregiver to my grandmother who chose to stay at home, and also to my mother who was living with dementia. And everyone except her doctor, everyone said long-term care is so much work, the stigma, and you're wasting your life and these things. Is how That's how caregiving is often perceived. But the doctor said, she will probably only live for about 18 months because she's so energized, and she will just have a lot of drugs given to her. because there is over medication as well, as we all know. It was hard to watch, and even with the wound, I'll just say that I've experienced very smaller versions of that at home, and we were able to heal that. But I could feel the pain of the families suffering, and just that it makes me emotional right now, actually, to think about it and to talk about it. What are some of the biggest challenges that you faced while creating this film? You mentioned that obviously COVID did bring all of this to light, right? Like, now we have a spotlight on the situation. So yeah, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced while creating this film? Money money aside, and or speak to that. And were people willing to share their stories openly? Like, just so curious about the process.
Sure. I think there were many things in my mind because let's face it, this topic is difficult. We don't want to think about ourselves becoming frail and vulnerable. It's very scary, and when we think of our loved ones, we don't want to think that their care in the future or in the present is going to harm them. So my question to myself as a filmmaker: how can I tell this story that's not going to be so totally scary and demoralizing to the public? And I think after meeting Melissa, I felt that there was a character who I could work with to show that there's energy and there's conviction about making the situation different. Because we all say, "Oh no, I don't want to go to an old, a nursing home. I don't want to end up there." Even in the film, Melissa says that all her clients who are in long-term care never imagined that they would be there. So I think we have to find ways, and Julia, I would love to, you've studied this as well. How do we tell these stories that that convey or communicate or share to the public and say, yes, this is a very difficult situation, but we can change things, that we have to, or we must look at these realities, but we can't just stay there. We have to be able to imagine something different. And I think that's what I've tried to do in the film. If you notice, I never filmed inside the nursing homes. I created a very, I think, a visual way to evoke that kind of context. And I used a lot of objects and lighting. And I tried to make this film, it sounds odd because it's not a beautiful subject, but I tried to make the film really beautiful. And that's the feedback that I'm receiving, that people find the film beautiful and they want to talk about these issues once they're finished the film.
And I think that's one of the things that is so beautiful about this film, is that it really exposes the humanity of the people involved, right? Because of societal stigma around aging, older adults are so often invisible, and particularly older adults in care homes have that increased invisibility. And, Sally Shivers, who's a age studies scholar, talks about how our sort of story or representation of going into a care home is one of failure, right? We have failed at independence. We have failed at caring for our loved ones. Not that that's the truth, but that's how it gets represented. And so to show a story that really highlights the humanity of people through sort of, I loved how you incorporated all of the photographs of people across their lifetime to show the richness of their stories and their histories, and those personal voices of the families really bringing out like who these older adults were as people. I think is so important. And also choosing a central character like Melissa Miller, who is so dynamic, and the team around her, as well as the other researchers and care providers, like the care staff that you highlighted, and just giving examples of how people can be strong advocates is such an important offering.
One thing thanks, Julia. One thing that I really learned through this project is that when we talk about recipients of care, elders or vulnerable people who need care, we can't separate them from the care workers because, we've all heard this saying, the conditions of work are the conditions of care, but it's so true. If we don't empower and respect and support the people that we're hoping will care for us or our loved ones, I just don't know how we can expect good care. We can't. So I think as much as this film um, tries to uplift the struggle for good care for our loved ones, it must also uplift care workers because as one union organizer in the film says, if things don't change, those care workers are just gonna they're gonna end up working for Amazon or Google or something, through a computer, and you can't care for people through a computer. We need to respect and to reward the people that have such a hard job creating, you know, situations of care.
It is very true. And yeah, overworked, underpaid, underappreciated, doing extremely hard work. And this film really does point out how it starts at the top. And I love how you showed that the blame wasn't placed where it's usually placed.
I mean, the intersection of ageism, ableism, and then like the feminization of the workforce. It's a very racialized workforce working in long-term care. It's like just a cocktail that makes it completely invisible, and like people don't really want to think about it. And I love how you use the illustrations in the film to kind of show the more messier parts of it that we don't really want to talk about, but it's really important for people to acknowledge that as well. Helene, I'm curious, did you receive any comments from any kind of government representatives, like provincial or federal, or from the Canadian Association for Long-Term Care, or similar groups like that? Or even from the company representatives, the companies that were mentioned in the film?
Yes, good question. The film is just coming out, and so I'm wondering, and I know that Melissa and her firm also are curious about how the film will be seen. So it's sort of an evolving story. I think the film, I really feel this in my bones that whoever can use the film to advance this cause. Not everyone knows that long-term care is not under the Canadian Health Act. We're really vulnerable to privatization. Privatization is on the increase. And actually, I've been speaking to care advocates in the States, in Europe, and the UK, and it's happening everywhere. And we have to even be speaking between provinces, between countries, because it's the same pattern everywhere. There is money to be made in the boomer industry. And unless we demand from our politicians that we deserve good care, that we should expect good care, we might be put in a very, very difficult place in terms of securing not just decent care, but adequate, respectful,
Yeah,
dignified care.
Mm-hmm. And I think the film did an amazing job of showing that this system is working for some people. There's people who are profiting off of this. It's working for some people. So it is going to take something to actually change it. Did you consider reaching out to any of these stakeholders while you were making the film?
I did consider it, but in terms of following Melissa, it becomes very difficult because she's representing hundreds of clients, and that was sort of part of our agreement, and I totally agreed with it, never to put the clients and their cases in danger. So that would have been really, really difficult. In fact, we kept what we were doing under wraps pretty well. But I think there's going to be so much, hopefully there will be a lot of discussion to come. And I think we will hear from, the corporate side. I hope so. Maybe you can interview some of them.
That'd be great. Yeah, that's kind of the next question that we had for you is What impact do you hope this film can have? We can ask it to both of you. You might both want to weigh in on this, but what impact do you hope, do you think it can have? What actions do you hope it inspires? If you both want to speak to that, that's...
Yeah, I mean, I hope, for one, that it is widely viewed and that it really just exposes these issues. Like, I think a lot of people aren't fully aware that there are for-profit care homes. And, you know, the situation in BC anyways is that we have some long-term care facilities that are owned and operated by the health authority. And then the rest are contracted out. And of those that are contracted, some are contracted to not-for-profit societies and some are contracted to for-profit companies. So that means that public money is subsidizing beds in the for-profit care homes. And I think that a lot of people aren't always aware of that, right? So even though they're getting a subsidized, publicly funded bed, it's existing within this for-profit care home, and it's the resident is living under the conditions of a care home that's focus is on making profit. So I think that exposing that is one of the biggest things about this film that is so important.
I agree with Julia that knowledge is power. And I think we have to have also a countrywide discussion about our pension plan investments, because they are invested not only in long-term care, for-profit long-term care in Canada, but around the world. There's been horrible, horrible scandals, for example, in France with some of their private long-term care homes. And guess who's like been on the board? Our general pension scheme. So there's a lot that's not known, a lot that's tied into these for-profit long-term care corporations. And one other thing that I hope that will come out of this film is that a lot of the home care that, you know, people are so desperately in need of and want to stay home is also tied to these for-profit companies. So if we are a country that prides itself on a socialized medicine, like we love the idea as Canadians, like 99% want good long-term care. That's part of our socialized medicine system. So this is what we have to really convey to our politicians, that it's essential.
Yeah, that's so true. And here in BC, the mandate is home first, because people do better at home. Seniors, people living with chronic illness, dementia, etc., do better at home. And if we're all lucky, I always say this, but if we're all lucky, we're all going to be seniors at some point, right? So how can we set this up for success? Yeah, no, this is really great.
Julia, what do you see ways we can improve long-term care for seniors?
I mean, the Seniors Advocate again, in that A Billion More Reasons to Care, has recommendations for long-term care. So they include ensuring that direct care funding is actually spent on direct care, which involves increasing accuracy and transparency around reporting on compliance and funded hours. So right now it's like self-report and hours of indirect care sometimes get blended in. It's not always that clear. So the reporting needs to be improved. There needs to be a standardized definition of what profit is and what counts as profit, so that we can understand what expenses are allowable and what is considered reasonable profit and what is excessive. And there also needs to be like transparency around reporting the revenues and expenditures in publicly funded care homes. So that needs to be open to the public so that we can understand what's happening with those finances. And then beyond like those kind of policy implementations, I think like socially, these kinds of stories that we tell about care are really important. So on the one hand, having stories like Helene has created that expose inequities and mistreatment are so important, and that also highlight advocates and ways of being advocates. And I think also developing ways of telling stories about positive models of care. So, like the dementia villages that are being developed. The first publicly funded one is opening in Comox, BC, in the summer. And so that is really exciting. So, dementia villages are communities where people live in like houses or cottages together and can participate in the daily activities of life, like making meals, doing laundry, and they have freedom of movement, and they can, they have an indigenous gathering place and a chapel and a bistro and a cafe and a salon. So they're more like a community. There are other models of long-term care where university students live in the long-term care residence for free in exchange for participating in the long-term care community for periods of time each week. So kind of highlighting some of these other stories and models are really important, as well as like imaginative stories through fiction, right? Like how can we imagine situations of long-term care that are not places people want to escape from, right? Like one of the genres of long-term care stories is the long-term care escape home story. And that is all about people wanting to get out of there. And how can we imagine places where people want to be and live in connection and community, and also acknowledge that in the later stages of life, people do experience complex, nuanced experiences and situations where there can be joy and relationship and community. And also people are reckoning with death and experiencing ill health. And how can we think about experiences of well-being that also incorporate experiences of ill health or ill-being? So then they're not dichotomous and separate, and we don't have to have these binaries where a place is good or bad. And it could incorporate those really complex experiences of late life and share those with the public so they're not hidden away.
Stolen Time is opening this Thursday in Vancouver, and then Montreal on Friday, and then you go Edmonton, Toronto. It's really making its way across the country. Is there any way people can find out more information about the film?
Sure. One way is just to Google Stolen Time, and National Film Board and Intuitive Pictures are the producers. So there's lots of information online. But this is just the real beginning of our voyage with the film. So it will be accessible to lots of organizations, community groups. We plan to really use it as much as possible and make it widely available. The National Film Board of Canada, which is distributing the film in Canada, is very, very enthusiastic about really sharing the film as much as possible, making it easy for people to watch.
Well, thank you so much for sharing it with us. We really appreciate your time and for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It was great to meet you, and congratulations with your work.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
For more Talking Aging, keep up with us on Instagram at Talking Aging. That's @talking_aging.